Medieval cities weren't broken drafts of modern life. They ran councils, counted money, kept courts, taught Latin, treated the poor, and raised stone cathedrals that still tower over us. They also stank, argued, and fined you for dumping eel skins. If London was every vice in one place, why did people sprint toward its gates, step inside before the curfew bell slams them shut? Medieval people didn't sleep through history. As ships crossed the channel and market days multiplied, rural teenagers understood that city wages beat harvest pay. Villages by castles, monasteries, and river forks began to raise walls, set towers, and lock gates. Inside grew lanes of timber houses, overhanging gables, workshops at street level, beds upstairs, and a great church at the center setting the rhythm for taxes and bells. Markets braided these lanes together, pulling strangers into daily patterns that felt new and risky. Why ditch the manor? On estates, serfs were bound to land, marriages needed permission, and corvée days fed someone else's field. In town, skill turned into cash. In many places, residents who stayed a year and a day unclaimed could be recognized as free, a municipal magnet that pulled people through gates and into guild halls. Freedom here was procedural, not romantic, and it lived in paperwork, witnesses, and time. Freedom, though, was just the entry ticket. Once you crossed the threshold, the city ran on stone, keys, and fear of being locked out after dark. Walls weren't vanity, they were insurance. Towers interrupted the curtain, arrow slits frowned at the ditch, and gatehouses watched the roads.
Master Thorn, I
By
cannot
day,
possibly pay 3
traders,
silers for a spilled
peasants,
ink.
and pilgrims streamed in and out. At dusk, the bell warned, the doors swung shut, and the keys went to the night watch. The wall turned outside chaos into inside order unless someone opened a shutter to empty a chamber pot. Security was a choreography of stone and routine, rehearsed every evening. Urban form obeyed one blunt rule: functions mix. A forge next to a bakehouse, an inn beside a furrier, a granary shouldering, a fish stall. The names survive: Pie Corner, Fisher Row, Apothecary Street proof that street identity stuck to the work done on it. Work and dwelling overlapped so tightly that smoke, bread, and metal all shared the same air. Crowding, minted profit, and also minted dirt. Dirt forced cities to learn a new civic art: managing what people throw away. They didn't know bacteria, but they knew stench. Gutters ran down the middle. Cesspits soaked up what households couldn't carry, and summer heat boiled everything to a reek. If someone shouted, "Gardez-l'eau!" from an upper window, you didn't look up. You sidestepped, swore, and plotted revenge. Everyone knew exactly which corners stank first when the sun climbed. Regulation arrived early. Councils fined people for throwing waste from bedchambers, ordered homeowners to sweep the frontage on a set day, and, after the Black Death of 1347, 1351 reaching England in 1348, tightened expectations around filth. If your doorway stank, your purse suffered, and your neighbors noticed. Public shame did as much work as the fines did. Orders are only words, unless backed by logistics. To make streets truly livable, cities needed routes, carts, and a budget line. Late 14th century records point to London experimenting with scheduled refuse collection, paid in part by fines on dodgy brewers. Picture a dozen carts hauled by 24 horses, moving set circuits. Householders kept rubbish indoors until they heard the bell and the wheels. York and Norwich ran weekly rounds. Coventry aligned its cart with the mandated Saturday sweep. By the early 1500s, London's pickups reportedly increased several times per week as demand spiked. Even the noise of wheels became a promise that the street would be passable by noon. Visitors, animals, and markets still threw grit into the gears. Scavengers and rakers worked endlessly, scraping, hauling, and boating waste to dumps beyond the walls. At night, gong farmers climbed into cesspits with hooks and buckets, doing the foulest work that kept the rest of the city breathing. Their labor drew a boundary between the city's appetite and the fields that fed it. Cleanliness quieted the nose. But the city had another pulse to steady security when the sun went down. Some towns saw theft, assaults, and homicides rise in late 14th century worries. The pattern varied, but fear was real. Curfew was the fix. Bell, bolt, patrol. The watch questioned strangers. Aldermen prosecuted fast to keep order visible. Night turned commerce into caution and gossip into testimony. The city taught people to measure risk by the sound of that bell. The loudest dangers lived next door. A pot of urine thrown wrong, a heap of eel skins dumped outside a shop, a shouted insult at an alderman brawls started from small sparks. Coroner's rolls and court books record quarrels that leapt in a heartbeat from noise to knives. Urban peace was a negotiation, daily and personal. Neighbors learned to read tempers like weather and shut shutters early. Transition. Those ugly cases also show something impressive. Cities taught themselves to govern with fines and records instead of feuds and rumors. The eelskin episode isn't comic relief, it's property law in action. Dumping refuse at a rival's threshold attacked livelihood. Chasing the dumper with a stick was rough. Private enforcement. Tossing urine from a window risked public harm. Falling while doing it turned a prank into a cautionary tale that juries remembered. Custom became case law, one scuffle at a time. Responsibility reached every doorstep. Fail to sweep, pay. Dump at the wrong hour, pay. Keep pigs inside the walls, pay. In some places, councils even paid informers to report waste dumping, a small bounty that turned irritation into evidence and made cleanliness a civic game. Turning annoyance into cash flow was the era's smartest sanitation hack. But a city is more than brooms and bench fines. It is a money machine. Watch trade pull a thread from London across the channel. Follow the wool. Sheep were clipped in English shires, brokers loaded bales in London, barges ran down the Thames, and ships crossed to Bruges and Ghent, where Flemish hands carded, spun, wove, and dyed cloth. Finished textiles fanned back across markets, some returning to England. That supply chain explains why those cities often shared similar sizes in certain periods. Along that route sailed contracts, credit, and gossip about prices. Urban populations were small by modern standards. Many towns counted in the low thousands or tens of thousands. Cautious estimates put London around 80,000, 100,000 by the early 1300s, before the 1348 plague in England cut hard. York and Bristol hovered near 10,000, 12,000. Most European towns were smaller. Exceptions existed. Paris could top 100,000 inches the 14th century, but hundreds of thousands were rare. Scale was modest, but density multiplied. Contact, conflict, and creativity. Money flows shape rules, and city rules wore guild seals, market books, and signatures in iron gall ink. Guilds protected craft. They set apprenticeships, tested skills, capped shop numbers, and policed quality. In return, members gained market rights, compensation in accidents, and a safety net when illness hit. The house itself stacked functions: street-level shop and workshop, sleeping loft above, stock in the cellar under boards. Standards were enforced with fines, inspections, and sometimes public unmaking of faulty goods. Above them stood merchants, lawyers, and landlords on councils. Below them labored porters, newcomers, and day workers, but the bottom did not always mean voiceless. Porters could strike by simply not showing up. Apprentices had statutes backing their training. Even rakers showed up in court to claim wages. Status was negotiable at the edge of a ledger and a workbench. Cities also schooled minds. Not only hands learned, pens and ledgers did too. Literacy had a queue and a price. Parish grammar schools taught boys to read, write, and reckon the ladder to clerkships, law offices, and mercantile work. Universities bloomed early. Bologna, Paris, and Oxford drew students, loans, books, and arguments. Ideas moved on the same roads as wool and wine, and disputations followed trade fairs. Literacy changed class by letting memory live on parchment instead of in favors. Hospitals meant hospitia, houses for the poor, the ill, and pilgrims, food, beds, prayer, and some care. They weren't modern clinics, but they wove charity into the urban fabric. Parish churches handled souls, civic courts handled contracts, chancery scribes stitched both into parchment. Care was moral infrastructure as much as material service. And then there were projects that ate centuries' symbols of faith and engines of payroll at once. York Minster began in 627. The immense Gothic we admire reached completion in 1472. That timeline is wages, tithes, scaffolds, hoists, and stained glass by the acre. Cologne Cathedral broke ground in 1248, surged, stalled for long stretches, and was largely completed only much later, a reminder that ambition can outrun lifetimes. Generation after generation signed their names in stone without ink. Cathedrals punched paychecks into every trade: masons, glaziers, carpenters, smiths, rope makers, carters, and tavern keepers. They didn't just swallow money, they recirculated it. When vaults rose, inns filled, quarry fires glowed, and markets laid out extra boards, faith and payroll reinforced each other like ribs in a vault. Transition. Cities could be miracles or moral panics, depending on who looked. London shows both faces without blinking. Richard of Devizes, a 12th century monk, damned London as a sink of vices: gambling, drink, trickery. He wasn't hallucinating. Crowds attract predators. Court rolls bristle with thefts, short measures, counterfeit goods, and fights over waste. The curfew bell didn't only stop walking, it paused opportunity. His disgust was a diagnosis of crowd behavior rather than a unique London sin. William Fitzstephen, a cleric of the same era, praised the same city for grand devotions and lively pastimes: skating, football, festivals. Both accounts are accurate because cities amplify. They turn piety into procession and mischief into headlines. Be honest. Would you choose silent fields or loud chances? Choice in cities was always a wager on opportunity beating nuisance. Before choosing, weigh the forces that pushed numbers up and down: plague, prices, and plain fear. In the early 1300s, London likely stood near 80,000, 100,000. Then the Black Death, 1,000, 347, 1,000, 351. In England, 1,348, crashed numbers. Other towns shrank too. Houses emptied, wages swerved, and then populations crawled back in uneven spurts. Urban demographics were jagged lines: growth, fall, recovery, more seismograph than staircase. Demography was a windsock, not a monument. Sources are patchy, so we speak carefully. Yet the broad picture is solid. Most medieval cities were modest. Exceptions were few. What's certain is how quickly urban governments learned. Scheduled carts instead of random dumping, fines instead of vendettas, curfew keys instead of private militias, and stone paving where mud once robbed time. Adaptation, not size, explains why the lights stayed on. Transition. By now the street smells cleaner, the night watch yawns, and carts roll at dawn. One last question. Why did people still run toward the wall despite the risks? Because the city sold three things rural life rationed: cash, freedom, and networks. Guilds backed workers when injury struck. Schools unlocked literacy for mobility. Courts settled quarrels in money rather than blood. Markets turned craft into income. Yes, there was noise, smell, and danger. There was also a staircase. Networks let small talents scale into livelihoods. That is why a runaway serf risked it. A year and a day was round one. An apprenticeship, a guild entry, and a cramped garret over a shop were rounds 2 and 3. Life rewrote itself to the bell of the church, the rumble of the refuse cart, and the clang of the smith. Those sounds feel chaotic, but they are the heartbeat of an urban civilization learning to clean itself, feed itself, and govern itself. What sounded like chaos was in fact coordination at street scale. So let's lock in what we've learned. Medieval cities weren't failed moderns. They were different machines solving different problems with different tools. Medieval cities were compact engines tuned for a rough world. Walls for safety, bylaws for waste, guilds for income, schools for mobility, cathedrals for meaning, and markets for motion. Most were small by today's yardstick. Their sizes wobbled with plague and prices. Their records can be thin. Even so, the operating system is visible: carts instead of cesspools, fines instead of feuds, contracts instead of curses. Devizes saw vice, Fitzstephen saw vitality. The truth is both at once. Listen closely, and you can still hear the curfew bell and the broom on stone holding chaos one sweep away. If this reset your mental map of the Middle Ages, subscribe and ring the bell. Comment City Gate and I'll share a source pack and a trade route map in the next episode's description. Next week, we test a sharp myth. Were cities actually dirtier than villages, or just dirty in a different way? Don't blink when the keys turn and the gates close.